Bună dimineața, stimați reprezentanți ai mass media.
Good morning, dear representatives of the mass media. I am Nicolae Panfil, Program Director at the Promo-LEX Association and head of the 11th of July Early Parliamentary Election Observation Mission of Promo-LEX. I would like to thank you for being here for this press conference. Today we invited you here to introduce you to the observation mission because it's today that it is launched and to present the #1 monitoring report covering the pre-electoral period and a short while of the electoral period up till the 11th of May 2021. I would like to start by thanking the donors and partners of the Promo-LEX Association, without the support of which we wouldn't have been able to make the monitoring effort. First of all, I'd like to thank the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and the Soros Moldova Foundation, who contribute to this observation mission by covering the costs associated with the monitor's work, who will focus on monitoring aspects such as hate speeches, discrimination in the electoral context. From the outset, I would like to make some clarifications regarding the work of the observation mission so that these things are known and understood by citizens and electoral stakeholders, for them to know how the Promo-LEX Association will work in the near future. Speaking about the purpose of the observation mission, traditionally it is one, to raise awareness, to inform the citizens and electoral stakeholders about the election roadmap, about the positive and not so positive aspects noticed throughout the campaign, so that on the one hand we could prevent issues and irregularities around the conduct of elections, while also keeping informed all the stakeholders about what is going on during the election campaign. It is very important to mention also that as a result of every observation mission, following that we make not only findings but also recommendations that are to contribute to improvements to the legal framework and electoral practices in Moldova. A couple of words about the monitoring methodology that is to be implemented for these elections. Again, traditionally the Promo-LEX Association carries out observation mission that involves long-term observers and short-term observers, and for this election there will be 43 long-term observers, and they would also cover the polling stations abroad and the transnistrian region. As regards the short-term observers, the format will be the following. At national level, there will be about 600 static observers in the polling stations. They will be selected on the basis of random sampling so as to ensure a representative sample and proportionate distribution of them across the country. And the results that will be collected on election day for them to be representative for the entire country. And besides the static observers in the polling stations, there will be about 140 observers in mobile teams. There will be 70 mobile teams that will travel across the territory of the country, monitoring the other polling stations that were not covered by the sample, and also monitoring the national roads, access roads, the areas adjacent to the polling stations, because a lot of phenomena on election day happen outside the polling station, not only inside of it. We would also like, as in the previous elections, to ensure a complete coverage of the polling stations for voters in the Transnistrian region. At this moment in time, we cannot tell how many polling stations will be open there, but we will certainly do our best to cover all of them. And about 60 polling stations from among those that will be opened for the citizens from the diaspora. Yet again, we don't know how many polling stations will be opened abroad, but that is what we would like to achieve nevertheless. Short-term observers on election day will collect information and will send it to the central team, and the central team will draft reports, press releases, and there would also be press conferences. Therefore, besides the 6 monitoring reports that will be developed throughout the election campaign, these are periodic reports that will be developed every 2 weeks. On election day, we will have press releases and press conferences too. In the evening of the election day, our observers will collect, on the basis of sampling, will collect the vote tally sheets, and we will carry out the parallel vote tabulation so that the next day after elections we can provide the results of the parallel vote tabulation to either confirm or highlight what we found in comparison with the information that will have been provided by the authorities. Concurrently, note that there will be a final report at the end of the campaign, and it'll include all the findings that we've arrived at throughout the monitoring of the campaign, and it'll also include all the recommendations meant for the stakeholders, electoral contenders, and the Central Electoral Commission. It is important to note that the Promo-LEX Association is not a political opponent. It is not a contender, and therefore, the monitoring work is based on good faith, on its independence, on the independence of this mission, and therefore we will try to collect pieces of evidence, proofs regarding the aspects that we will mention in the monitoring report. At the same time, we need to highlight at the outset that we don't have the legal obligation to support with proof what will have been introduced in the reports. We're not an investigation body that is to collect evidence and submit that in some other body. At the same time, if the authorities require it, women authorities, not election contenders, the pieces of evidence might be made available to the authorities if we happen to report on certain irregularities and if that information is asked for by the authorities. I would like to mention that the Promo-LEX observers are trained for every campaign, and this is not going to be an exception. Both long-term and short-term observers will be trained, and they will sign a code of conduct of observers whereby they commit to work in a non-partisan, independent way and in good faith, same as until now. I would also like to let the citizens know that they have the possibility to notify, to report different pieces of information regarding the election campaign, regarding the work of election contenders in the territory. They can go to the electoral.monitor.md. It's a website dedicated to notifications from citizens, and it's also a website where the Promo-LEX Association, where its observation mission is going to store data and information on the basis of what will have been observed by the observers in the territories. I would like to mention that the work of the observation mission will be complemented by a component that is just as important as the observation, and that's called voter awareness raising and education. And for this purpose, we will carry out a number of activities. First and foremost, it's the traditional video spots that will be produced to raise the awareness and to motivate voters to go out to vote. Also, sub-grants will be appropriated to local organizations that will be able to carry out activities out in the territories or at national level to, yet again, inform the citizens about the elections and to motivate them to participate. There will be a cycle of debates. There will be about 10 debates in partnership with a number of media outlets, same as we did for the previous elections. Broadly speaking, these are the activities around awareness raising and education of voters, and that in parallel with the election monitoring work. I was saying that this press conference is dedicated not only to the launching of the mission, but also it is dedicated to the presentation of the first monitoring report. It covers the period from 23 December 2020 till the 11th of May 2021. So we took 23 December as an initial point because it's that at that time that the Kiku government has resigned and all political processes commenced back then that led to the initiation of the current elections. In this regard, in the #1 monitoring report, one can find a number of relevant chapters. First of all, we have tackled the political context right before this election campaign, and in this regard, we'd like to mention that these parliamentary elections of 11th of July are the 10th elections of this type in Moldova and the 5th snap election in Moldova. So we could say things are quite intense in this regard in Moldova. This election is conducted in a context where there is a constant drop of citizens' trust in public authorities. In terms of some figures, according to the public opinion barometer, the trust of citizens in the parliament has decreased by about 14% in 2020 compared to 2019. This sort of a situation was also found in relation to the government of Moldova. The only institution that enjoys the same level of trust since 2019 to 2020 is the presidential office. Another phenomenon that has affected and affects the image of the parliament and the socio-political life in the country is party switching. Throughout the 2 years of the 10th legislature, about 20% of the MPs migrated from one party to another. So there are MPs from PDM, the Democratic Party. In this context, we'd like to mention that in 2020, the Parliament has even made a statement that was unanimously voted, a statement regarding or condemning party switching and malpolitics. A significant impact that led to snap elections or an important event in this regard were the presidential elections last autumn. We know very well that on the agenda of the two contenders in the second round, there was the promise to dissolve the parliament. When Maia Sandu took office, being elected as president, this promise has become a priority of her mandate. And therefore, over the last months, constant efforts have been made to set off snap elections. And, of course, this was observed and reflected in the #1 monitoring report. We've highlighted all the stages: the resignation of Mr. Kiku on the 23rd of December, the two attempts to elect a new prime minister, and we highlighted all the political affairs around this matter. Lastly, on the 15th of April, the Constitutional Court ruled on the dissolution of the Parliament, and it found, in fact, grounds for dissolving the Parliament. And on the 28th of April, the Parliament was dissolved as soon as the Constitutional Court ruled that the state of emergency established by parliamentary majority was unconstitutional. And therefore, the election date was set for the 11th of July 2021. And in this regard, one aspect that is very important to mention, speaking about the socio-political context, and that was also reflected in the report, that's something around the pandemic. The pandemic context and the declaration of the state of emergency. I mentioned previously the decision of the of the Constitutional Court in this regard. And obviously, this subject was an inherent topic for the pre-electoral period. There were debates around either having snap elections as soon as possible or dealing with the consequences of the pandemic first and then carrying out the elections. Still, the political stakeholders took rapid measures, and as the promises were formulated during the campaign and as they came up in the president's strategy, a decree was issued dissolving the parliament, which set off the beginning of the electoral period. So the mandate of the 10th legislature was to expire, to lapse out in 2023. In this regard, we are certainly to see what is to be the legal framework that is to support the elections of the 11th of July 2021. Certainly, we will look at the amendments that were made to the law from 2019 onward, and the most important amendment is the change in the electoral system in August 2019. The parliamentary majority of the time decided to go back to the closed list proportional representation. And as a consequence, a number of amendments to the legal framework ensued. So some of them were technical, looking at terms in the electoral code, but there were other amendments, quite important amendments as well, such as the reduction of the electoral threshold for parties or for electoral blocks from 8 to 7%. There was a minimum representation threshold of 2% for independent candidates, as it was until 2019. And then they went back to the formula on the distribution of mandates of seats that are outside votes given to blocks or parties that are not to exceed to parliament. This is the formula that was in place until 2010 in Moldova and was reintroduced in 2019, and it is advantageous for large parties who would be the key beneficiaries of citizens' votes. I must also mention the fact that the number of signatures to be collected by independent candidates increased from 501,000 to 2,500 signatures. For women candidates, from 250,500 signatures to 1,500 signatures. These provisions are important in the context, or are important depending on whether we will have independent candidates in the electoral race. Another important thing is the minimum gender representation quota of 40%. It is for the first time that legal provisions were introduced that are clearer around this topic, and they will demand that at least 4 candidates of the same gender are present in every 10 places on the list of parties registered in the electoral race. This is a mandatory request, and the election contenders are supposed to observe this requirement, otherwise they risk not being registered in the electoral race. In the last year before elections, the electoral code was amended 2 times, but it's only one of the laws that have to do with the electoral campaign or the organization of parliamentary elections. So the law 162 of July 2020 has made some amendments to the list of authorities that have the obligation to provide proper conditions for the citizens living abroad so that they could exercise freely their voting rights. And it's also through that law that the political party law was amended. And in this regard, the number of signatures required for establishing a political party was decreased, which is important in the context of the parliamentary elections because we have parties who already have tapped into this possibility, and at present it's only 1,000 signatures that have to be collected by a political party to be registered, compared to the 4,000 signatures that used to be required previously. And also previously, these signatures were supposed to be collected from all across the country, from most of the territorial administrative units, while this obligation is no longer enforced now. It has been removed from the law. And these amendments were possible thanks to a constitutional court decision that covered this matter and that found that those provisions were not constitutional, that they were somewhat limiting because of the large numbers of signatures required, as well as this geographical location requirements. This is important because speaking about independent candidates or the independent electoral contenders, then we can notice that they, as previously mentioned, they are to submit up to 2,500 signatures to gain access to the ballot, to get on the ballot, while a political party only needs 1,000 signatures to be created. And therefore, we can see that there is some discrimination against electoral contenders compared to electoral blocks or political parties. In our report, we also covered a draft law 263 from June 2020 that was not passed following the second reading. And in this context, Promo-LEX and other organizations, other civil society organizations have been promoting a number of improvements and have made some recommendations regarding improvements to the legal framework. They were not implemented, though, by the authorities. And in this regard, we must mention, first of all, the regulations and the rules regarding the prohibition of hate speech and regarding the legal liability and gradual sanctions for violating the electoral law, the rules around the involvement of religious denominations in electoral activity, and sanctions, and regarding sanctions on organized transportation of voters to polling stations. We've noted this phenomena in the previous electoral campaigns, and unfortunately the Parliament has not found it appropriate to vote in a second reading in favor of these provisions to make us better prepared for the new elections. Speaking about Promo-LEX recommendations, in 2019, since the parliamentary elections in February 2019, back then, Promo-LEX has made 22 recommendations around improvements to the legal framework, but we found that only 7 of them were either fully or partially implemented by the authorities, while 15 others were ignored. Among the ones ignored, we'd like to note the fact that there is no explicit definition of administrative resources. Then we'd like to highlight the importance of the organized transportation of polling stations matter, and then the election campaign party funding reports is another matter that requires to be tackled. And there is the risk that most of these issues will take place again in the current electoral campaign. Speaking about the legal framework, in the report we've highlighted the need for CHEC, the Central Electoral Commission, to review the guidelines on COVID-19 infection prevention. In the previous elections, for the presidential elections, it was approved. These were approved by the National Extraordinary Public Health Committee. However, we believed back then and now still that this committee did not have the authority, was not the one to pass that sort of measures, and there were other irregularities and issues with the document approved by the National Extraordinary Public Health Committee. And We'd like to reiterate the recommendation to the Central Electoral Commission to go back to the guidelines and to pass its own guidelines in consultation with the National Committee specializing in the public health matter. But yet again, it has to be a document that the Czech is owner of. It could be one that could include or cover matters around the conduct of the electoral campaign by election contenders, regulating the conditions in which they could carry out their campaign in the territories when it comes to voter meeting and so on and so forth. Another important matter, speaking about the legal framework still, and one issue that we've kept an eye on in the near past, this has to do with the funding of the electoral campaign, that is about the money required for organizing elections. In this context, there's been public discussions around the lack of funds in the state budget that were not appropriated or foreseen for this. And outside of the monitoring period on the 12th, we've noted that the government has identified 70 million lei out of the 125 million asked for or estimated by Czech as needed for organizing the elections of 11th of July. We'd like to note in this regard that it is necessary for the government to assume the obligation to fully cover the elections, because otherwise there's the risk and consequences. There could be consequences on the organization of elections, and it would be better to avoid such a situation. Speaking about the possibility to find more funds in addition to the 70 million lei, these being funds required for the work of Czech and electoral bodies, we mentioned in the report, and we reiterate that there are mechanisms provided for in the law of Moldova, mechanisms that say that the state budget can be adjusted and that up to 10% of the budget of other public institutions can be redirected towards elections, for the organization of elections. And there's also the possibility to tap into the government emergency fund and to fund the elections on the basis of that. And the 70 million lei were appropriated from the government emergency fund, in fact. We'd like to reiterate the importance of this matter, because obviously the Central Electoral Commission can carry out or can commence carrying out its work now already with that money and can cover some proportion of the costs, but it is necessary to ensure predictability and the confidence that all costs will be covered. Speaking about electoral bodies, in the number 1 report, we mentioned that on the 17th of June, the mandate of the Central Electoral Commission comes to an end. However, there are also provisions in the Electoral Code that say that the mandate shall be extended for no longer than 90 days if the elections are announced before the expiry of the mandate of the Central Electoral Commission, which allows the Central Electoral Commission to work until the 15th of September 2021. So we don't see any issue around this situation. We've also found that the Czech has had meetings in this period in a mixed format. It has had 3 meetings. One of them was ordinary and 2 extraordinary meetings. And on the 7th of May 2021, it passed in a new wording the regulation on the peculiarities of nomination and registration of candidates for members of parliament in the Parliament of Moldova. In this regard, we've paid attention and we've highlighted that a number of provisions of this regulation are in contradiction with the provisions of the Electoral Code, or some adjustments were not proper and they require to be reviewed by the Czech. Note that in the next period, starting with the 14th of May, the Czech is to start receiving the files for the registration of election contenders in terms of polling stations for the Transnistrian region and for the citizens from the diaspora. This is another important matter that was detailed in the #1 monitoring report. In this regard, Promo-LEX would like to highlight the need to increase the number of polling stations in countries like Germany, +6 polling stations, the Russian Federation +4 polling stations, the UK +4 polling stations, and also, on the other hand, we believe that in other countries like the USA, Romania, Italy, the number of polling stations could be decreased. This information is, of course, preliminary, and it is based on the current data available as at the 11th of May 2021. We mentioned this information here because it is important to emphasize that until the 26th of May 2021, the pre-registration procedure is still available. The pre-registration mechanism, the voter pre-registration mechanism, is one of the three tools, one of the three provisions or aspects covered in the law that influence the decision regarding the number of polling stations and their geographical location. That is to say, we need to know what the final number of pre-registered voters is by the 26th of May, and in the next report we will provide updated information regarding the calculations around the number of polling stations to be set up abroad. The pre-registration mechanism is also available for use for the citizens in the Transnistrian region, so we'd like to encourage the citizens from the Transnistrian region and the citizens from the diaspora to participate proactively, to participate in this stage and pre-register, because this way they have the possibility to influence, to determine, to help determine the number of polling stations that would be established, and that would be of help for the authorities too, to figure out where polling stations are needed. This is particularly relevant in since we're speaking about an austere budget for elections this time, because we don't have the certainty that the entire amount will be appropriated for the conduct of the election. So we recommend the Czech as well to carry out more earnestly awareness-raising campaigns promoting the voter pre-registration mechanism. And also speaking about electoral bodies in this report, and on the 28th of April 2021, we appealed to the Czech, and in that appeal, we recommended that the institution in charge of organizing elections, we recommended that the institution develop a plan whereby electoral officials and people authorized to participate in attending the carrying out of electoral procedures, so as for these to have the possibility to get vaccinated if they desire it. And amid the pandemic, it's important to make sure that all the measures aimed at the protection of citizens and election officials to be taken. And that's why we reiterate this request, this message to the Central Electoral Commission. The #1 report also covers other matters such as the voter list, the state voter register, and the current situation in the beginning of the election campaign. As at the 4th of May 2021 compared to September 2020, there's been a drop, although insignificant, but still a drop in the number of people registered in the state register of voters. That is about 7,000 voters less. At the same time, the number of voters without a domicile or without a place of residence is increasing, and the number of voters in the Transnistrian region is increasing, and they represent about 15% of the total number of voters. And this is an alarming matter It's a matter of concern because these citizens would vote on the basis of additional voter lists, and according to the good practices in elections, it is recommended that the number of such voters is as small as possible. Other matters that haven't been solved according to findings in the previous observation report. So there are some issues that were not solved and that are somewhat classical already. For instance, this incorrect distribution of voters to the polling stations or names of deceased people on the voter lists. That well, we'll see what is the situation now around this matter. We'll keep an eye on it, and we will let you know how things have evolved. On the 7th of May 2021, Czech has launched the procedure according to which one can report its new place of residence till the 10th of June. And in this regard, we urge the Czech to promote, to disseminate the information about this tool, about this possibility as much as possible. Because yet again, it is important for all citizens who want to vote to be able to, regardless of where they are on election day. And this mechanism allows one to register as a voter in a different polling station in a different place. So you can be registered with that polling station to be able to cast your vote when you know for certain that you will not be in that settlement where your place of residence is in fact recorded. As regards the LPA, this is another chapter that is detailed in our report. We highlighted the need for the LPA to be actively involved in fulfilling its duties around the organization of elections. In this regard, on the basis of findings in previous monitoring reports, we'd like to highlight a few problematic aspects. First of all, we'd like to emphasize that there is an insufficient number of members in the inferior electoral bodies, inferior appointment by level 1 and level 2 LPAs. In 18% of the precinct electoral bureaus, none of the members was appointed by the electoral councils, and out of these 18%, 86% were cases registered in Chisinau. So the LPA, the electoral councils have not lived up to their responsibility to appoint members. And of course, the precinct electoral bureau membership were filled in by members from the reserve, but the legal framework provides for the obligation of LPAs to live up to some commitments in this regard, so this should be observed. We also recommend proactive and constructive communication between the Czech and the local public administration authorities around the opening of polling stations, around identifying venues for polling stations, especially as regards polling stations opened for citizens in the Transnistrian region. In the previous elections, we remember there were a number of settlements where there were some issues and disagreements around this matter, and it would be good for these to be avoided this time. As regards potential election contenders, the right to be recorded on the ballot belongs to parties, either socio-political organizations, electoral blocs, and independent candidates. I have previously mentioned that independent candidates, from our point of view, are discriminated against when it comes to parliamentary elections, and perhaps in the future we'll come up with some recommendations around this matter for the legal framework to be amended so that these or those who want to participate can do that properly in elections. The Parliament has not amended the law that allows for the implementation of alternative signature collection procedures amid the pandemic. Promo-LEX has previously submitted an analysis recommending the relevant authorities to adopt alternative signature collection procedures, such as online collection of candidate nominating petition sheets, and why not establishing an electoral deposit in an amount of money that the candidate would deposit on the account of the Central Electoral Commission, and this way he or she would be granted the possibility to participate in elections. This is an international practice widespread in other countries, well established in other countries. As regards the funding of the electoral campaign, we will keep tabs on how this is going on, how the costs are covered for the costs for the electoral campaign, for the electioneering, for the work of initiative groups that support independent candidates, for instance. So, therefore, among the issues found in the previous elections and issues that we believe might happen on this occasion as well and that should be avoided by contribution in this regard from electoral contenders and by active monitoring by Czech women. In this regard, the reduced transparency of expenses incurred, not reporting certain expenses associated with electioneering, limiting the possibility of a candidate to participate in elections. There was a case where one election contender was not allowed to open the electoral fund account. So these issues need to be overcome in these elections. As regards the funding of initiative groups and election campaigns, we would like to highlight that there is the possibility for citizens of Moldova living abroad to make donations to election contenders that they want to support. Promo-LEX has been actively promoting this possibility that was introduced in 2019 in the legal framework. And as a result, we have the following situation at present. So an individual can donate to an election contender or to an initiative group up to 6 average wages per economy, which is about 52,000 lei. And a legal entity can donate up to 104,000 lei, which is about 12 average wages per economy. And these the donations made by the citizens, Moldovan citizens living abroad, would have to observe the limit of three average wages per economy, that is about 26,000 lei. This is important because we realize that elections cannot be carried out without funds. And the campaign-related activities require funds. And we would like to urge the Czech to be carefully watching the reports filed by the election contenders and to take required action if some issues or irregularities are found or if the expenditure is not reported properly. A last chapter of this report that is also very important is about hate speech and incitement to discrimination. Promo-LEX has been monitoring these issues since back in 2018, and it has noted that especially in the pre-electoral period and throughout the election campaign, there is a phenomena flourishing, such as, for instance, for the presidential elections in 2020, according to our monitoring reports, there have been on average 4.9 cases a day, which is an increase that is a 2.3 times increase compared to 2019, and would like to recommend election contenders to observe voluntarily a language and demeanor and communication that is healthy in an election campaign, and to urge them to avoid not to indulge in hate speech and discriminatory speech, because this isn't honorable for those who would like to be representatives of the people and who would like to govern and rule on behalf of the citizens. And therefore, I previously stated and mentioned that this is rather an urge for them to voluntarily observe the rules of proper conduct that apply to an electoral campaign. And to conclude, I would like to highlight that unfortunately, Parliament, and as previously mentioned, refused to adopt legal measures that would prevent this sort of situation. So all we can do is to urge those involved in the campaign to show respect and proper conduct. This was roughly about the content of the report. You can find the details in the report itself. As soon as it is edited, it'll be uploaded on the website and on the website of Promo-LEX. If you have any questions, please go ahead. If not, thank you for your attention, and I'd like to urge you to participate and watch and attend our next press conferences that, as I was saying, will be carried out throughout the election campaign every 2 weeks. And the next press conference will be held on the 27th of May at 10 o'clock. Thank you for your attention and have a nice day.